In the golden glow of Prague's Charles Bridge, a scream shatters the evening calm. A ruthless blackmailer lies dead, a knife in his heart, a cryptic note clutched in his hand. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster from Little Haddington, whose quiet wisdom unravels a web of secrets among a group of travellers. A desperate artist, a grieving governess, a secretive widow, and a pompous scholar. From a hidden cachet of jewels to a gold cufflink marked B, every clue points to betrayal, debt, and revenge. As the Vltava River reflects the city's shadows, Miss Marple's keen insight will expose a killer hiding in plain sight. Can she solve the murder before the truth slips away? Chapter 1. An Unexpected Invitation. In the quiet village of Little Haddington, where the hedgerows bloomed with late summer roses and the church clock ticked with unhurried precision, Miss Jane Marple sat in her neat parlour, a skein of pale blue wool resting on her lap. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where a letter lay, its crisp envelope bearing a foreign postmark. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her sharp eyes scanning the elegant handwriting of Lady Beatrice Langley. An old-school friend whose life of privilege had never dulled her propensity for trouble. "My dear Jane," the letter began, "I find myself in need of your company on a little excursion to Prague, a city of such charm it quite takes one's breath away. A select group of us are to explore its cultural treasures, and I should be delighted if you would join us at the Hotel Zlata. Do say you'll come. Your good sense would be a comfort." The words were warm, but Miss Marple detected a tremor of unease beneath Beatrice's polished phrases, as though the invitation masked a deeper plea. She set the letter down, her mind drifting to a long-ago incident in Little Haddington, when Mrs. Elwood's urgent request for a tea party had concealed a theft in her household. People, Miss Marple reflected, seldom said precisely what they meant. The decision was made with her usual quiet resolve. A trip to Prague, with its ancient bridges and Gothic spires, promised a change from the village's predictable rhythms, and Beatrice's anxiety piqued her curiosity. She penned a brief acceptance, packed a modest suitcase with her best tweeds and a warm shawl, for autumn in Prague could be brisk, and arranged for her neighbour, Mrs. Clement, to tend her geraniums. By the following morning, Miss Marple was aboard the Dover to Paris express, her knitting needles clicking softly as the train rattled toward the continent. The journey to Prague was long, and Miss Marple, seated in a cushioned compartment, observed her fellow travellers with the unobtrusive keenness of one accustomed to village intrigues. Beatrice had written of a small party, and soon enough Miss Marple identified them among the passengers. Lady Beatrice Langley, her silver hair impeccably styled, exuded an air of faded grandeur, though her frequent glances out the window betrayed nervousness. Beside her sat her nephew, Roger Langley, a handsome young man in his 30s, with an artist's careless charm and a smile too ready to be entirely sincere. His tweed jacket was well cut but frayed at the cuffs, suggesting debts he could ill afford. Across the aisle, Clara Henshaw, a pale governess with a pinched expression, clutched a worn novel, her fingers fidgeting with a silver locket at her throat. She seemed younger than her drab attire suggested, and her eyes darted toward Roger with a mixture of wariness and something softer. Dr. Ernest Blackwell, a portly man with a booming voice and a penchant for adjusting his tie, held forth on Prague's historical significance to anyone who would listen, which was chiefly himself. Finally, there was Victor Crane, a lean, sharp-faced man in a tailored overcoat, who kept to himself, his gaze fixed on a leather notebook he occasionally scribbled in. His silence was not that of shyness, Miss Marple noted, but of calculation, like Mr. Hodges, the little Haddington grocer who once swindled half the village before his schemes unravelled. As the train wound through the misty hills of Germany, Miss Marple's attention sharpened. Roger, lounging beside his aunt, leaned towards Victor Crane, his voice low but heated. "You know I'm good for it, Crane," he muttered, his charm replaced by a desperate edge. "Just give me time." Victor's reply was inaudible, but his cold smile and the dismissive flick of his hand spoke volumes, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind filing away the exchange. Money, she knew from village scandals, was a motive as old as time, and Roger's flushed cheeks suggested a debt he could not easily escape. Beatrice, catching Miss Marple's eye, offered a strained smile. "Jane, how good of you to come," she said, joining her at the window. "Prague will be splendid, don't you think? The Charles Bridge at sunset, they say, is like spun gold." Her voice was bright, but her fingers twisted the pearl brooch at her collar, a gesture Miss Marple recognized from their school days, when Beatrice had been caught fibbing to the headmistress. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, "though I dare say it's the company that makes a journey memorable." She let the words hang, watching Beatrice's expression flicker. The older woman murmured something about the hotel's comforts and retreated to her seat, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The group, she mused, was a curious mix bound by ties she could not yet see, like the tangled threads of a poorly knit scarf. Clara's locket, Roger's debts, Victor's secrecy, Blackwell's pomposity, and Beatrice's unease. Each was a stitch in a pattern she would unravel in time. As the train neared Prague, the landscape softened into rolling fields and distant spires, and Miss Marple felt a familiar stir of anticipation. She had no taste for adventure in the modern sense, but the human heart, with its secrets and frailties, was a puzzle she could never resist. Whatever lay ahead on the Golden Bridge of Prague, she was certain it would be far from ordinary. Chapter 2. The Golden Bridge. The city of Prague unfolded before Miss Jane Marple like a tapestry woven from history and shadow, its spires piercing a sky tinged with the amber of late afternoon. The Hotel Zlata, a grand edifice of cream stone and arched windows, stood sentinel over the Vltava River, its waters glinting beneath the autumn sun. Miss Marple, her small suitcase deposited in a room adorned with velvet drapes and a view of the river, joined Lady Beatrice Langley's party for their first excursion. A guided tour of the Charles Bridge, known to romantics as the Golden Bridge, for the way its ancient stones glowed at sunset. The prospect intrigued her, not for its beauty alone, but for the undercurrents she had sensed among her companions on the train, undercurrents that in her experience often presaged trouble. The group gathered in the hotel's marble-floored lobby, where Beatrice, resplendent in a fur-trimmed coat, fussed over Roger's untidy scarf with maternal concern. Roger Langley, his boyish charm restored after the train's tensions, flashed a grin that Miss Marple suspected was more performance than sincerity. Clara Henshaw, her plain grey dress doing little to conceal her nervous energy, clutched her locket as though it were a talisman. Dr. Ernest Blackwell, adjusting his spectacles, muttered about the bridge's 14th century origins, his voice carrying the weight of a man accustomed to lecturing. Victor Crane, however, stood apart, his sharp eyes scanning the lobby as if expecting an ambush. Miss Marple, her own shawl neatly pinned, noted his isolation with interest, recalling a little Haddington banker who kept secrets behind a similar mask of reserve. Their guide, a wiry Czech named Mr. Carroll, met them at the bridge's entrance, his enthusiasm for Prague's history undimmed by the chill wind sweeping across the Vltava. The Charles Bridge stretched before them, a Gothic marvel flanked by weathered statues of saints and kings, their stone faces solemn under centuries of soot. Tourists and street vendors bustled along its length, their voices mingling with the cries of gulls overhead. Mr. Carroll gestured grandly, recounting tales of emperors and alchemists, but Miss Marple's attention wandered to her companions. Roger lingered near a statue of St. John Nepomuk, sketching its contours in a small notebook, though his glances towards Victor suggested distraction. Clara, trailing behind, seemed to shrink from the crowd, her fingers tracing the locket's edge. Beatrice, arm linked with Miss Marple's, whispered about the bridge's beauty, but her eyes darted to Victor, who walked with the measured stride of a man guarding something precious. Blackwell, undeterred by the group's inattention, interrupted Mr. Carroll to expound on the bridge's architectural significance. "A masterpiece of medieval engineering," he declared, his voice booming over the chatter of passers-by. "The keystones, you see, are aligned with astrological precision." Clara flinched at his volume, and Miss Marple noted the governess's unease, wondering if it stemmed from the man's bluster or something deeper. In Little Haddington, she recalled, Miss Carter had trembled just so when her brother's debts came to light. Victor, unmoved by Blackwell's lecture, paused to light a cigarette, his match flaring briefly against the gathering dusk. The gesture, Miss Marple thought, was oddly deliberate, as if marking a moment. As the sun dipped low, painting the bridge in hues of gold and rose, the group reached the midpoint, where a statue of St. Wenceslas stood watch. Mr. Carroll recounted the saint's martyrdom, but his words were cut short by a piercing scream. The sound came from Clara, who stood frozen, pointing toward the statue's base. There, slumped against the weathered stone, was Victor Crane, his overcoat stained dark with blood. A knife protruded from his chest, its handle glinting cruelly in the fading light. The crowd parted, gasps rippling through the air. And Mr. Carroll, pale with shock, stammered for calm. Miss Marple, her heart steady despite the horror, stepped closer, her eyes taking in every detail. Victor's lifeless hand clutching a torn scrap of paper, his gold watch missing from his wrist, and a faint smear of mud on the cobblestones beside him. Beatrice clutched Miss Marple's arm, her face ashen. "Jane, oh Jane, what's happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Roger, his sketchbook forgotten, stared at the body, his earlier charm replaced by a sickly pallor. Clara, tears streaming down her cheeks, backed away, muttering, "I didn't mean, I only looked," before collapsing into sobs. Dr. Blackwell, for once silent, adjusted his tie with shaking hands, his eyes darting to the gathering crowd. Miss Marple, her mind as clear as a winter morning in Little Haddington, noted their reactions, each a thread in the pattern of guilt and fear she would soon unravel. Within minutes the Prague police arrived, led by Inspector Novak, a lean man with a hawk-like gaze, and a manner both courteous and unyielding. He cordoned off the scene, directing officers to keep the curious at bay. His questions were sharp, cutting through the group's shock. "Who was with Mr. Crane last?" he demanded, his accent clipped but precise. Roger admitted to walking near Victor earlier, but swore he'd moved ahead to sketch. Clara, still trembling, claimed she'd been admiring the river, though her muddy hem suggested otherwise. Beatrice, rallying her composure, said she'd been with Miss Marple, a fact the spinster quietly confirmed. Dr. Blackwell insisted he'd been studying a statue's inscription, though his flushed cheeks belied his calm. Inspector Novak examined the body, noting the knife, a plain utilitarian blade, not uncommon in Prague's markets. The scrap of paper in Victor's hand bore a single word, scrawled in black ink: debts. Miss Marple, permitted to linger near the scene as Beatrice's friend, studied the clue with care. The paper was thick, like stationery from a fine hotel, and the ink had a faint smear, as if written in haste. She glanced at Roger, whose debts had surfaced on the train, but her thoughts turned also to Clara's locket and Beatrice's unease. In Little Haddington, a similar note had once exposed a blackmailer, and Miss Marple wondered if Victor's death followed a similar thread. As the police escorted the group back to the Hotel Zlata, the bridge's golden glow faded into twilight, and a chill settled over the city. Miss Marple walked beside Beatrice, her mind sifting through the evening's events. The murder, she knew, was no random act. The knife's precision and the note's message suggested intent, perhaps personal. Victor's secrecy, Roger's desperation, Clara's distress, Blackwell's bluster, each offered a motive, yet none felt complete. She recalled a village scandal where a quiet grocer's wife had killed to protect a secret, her meekness a mask for resolve. Prague, with its ancient stones and hidden corners, was no different from Little Haddington, Miss Marple thought. Human nature, with its jealousies and betrayals, was the same everywhere. Back at the hotel, Inspector Novak announced that no one was to leave Prague until the investigation concluded. The group dispersed to their rooms, their faces etched with fear and suspicion. Miss Marple, retiring to her own, sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The Vltava flowed dark and silent below, reflecting the city's secrets. She thought of the bridge, its saints standing guard over centuries of sin, and knew that somewhere among her companions lay the truth, a truth she would uncover, as surely as she had unravelled the mysteries of Little Haddington. Chapter 3. Shadows of Motive. The Hotel Zlata's dining room, with its crystal chandeliers and starched linens, hummed with the subdued murmur of guests the morning after Victor Crane's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table, her teacup cradled in delicate hands, her eyes flitting over her companions with the quiet acuity of a birdwatcher. The Prague police, under Inspector Novak's firm direction, had commandeered a private parlour for interviews. And the group, Lady Beatrice Langley, Roger Langley, Clara Henshaw, and Dr. Ernest Blackwell, awaited their turns with varying degrees of unease. The air was thick with suspicion, like the fog that clung to Little Haddington's lanes after a winter rain, and Miss Marple sensed that each member of the party carried a secret, much as villagers hid their grudges behind polite smiles. Beatrice, seated beside Miss Marple, stirred her coffee with unnecessary vigour, her pearl brooch catching the light. "Jane, it's dreadful," she whispered, her voice low to avoid Roger's ears across the table. Victor was a wretched man, but to be stabbed like that, on the bridge, of all places. Her distress was genuine, but Miss Marple noted the way her friend's gaze lingered on Roger, whose pale face and restless fingers betrayed a sleepless night. Clara, opposite him, kept her eyes fixed on her untouched plate, her locket hidden beneath her high-necked blouse. Dr. Blackwell, alone at the table's end, scribbled notes in a leather-bound journal, his earlier bombast replaced by a nervous intensity. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, recalled a little Haddington curate, who had fidgeted just so when questioned about missing church funds. Inspector Novak entered the dining room, his sharp features softened by a courteous nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his English precise, "I will speak with each of you in turn. Please remain here until called." He gestured to a young officer who escorted Roger to the parlour first. As the door closed behind them, Miss Marple observed Clara's hands tighten, her knuckles white against the tablecloth. Beatrice leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Roger's in trouble, Jane. He owed Victor money, quite a lot, I'm afraid, but he's no murderer." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her expression serene but her mind alert. Debts she knew from village scandals could drive even the gentlest soul to desperation. In the parlour, Inspector Novak's questions were methodical, his notebook filling with precise annotations. Roger, slouching in a velvet chair, admitted to his argument with Victor on the train. "It was about a loan," he said, his voice strained. "Victor lent me funds for my art, but his terms were steep. I didn't kill him, though. I was sketching when it happened." Novak's eyes narrowed, noting Roger's frayed cuffs and the absence of his sketchbook at the crime scene. "And this loan?" the inspector pressed. "Did it involve anything else? A painting, perhaps?" Roger flushed, muttering a denial, but Miss Marple, later recounting the exchange to Beatrice, suspected he was hiding more than embarrassment. Clara was called next, her steps faltering as she left the dining room. Miss Marple, excused to fetch her shawl, lingered near the parlour door, her hearing sharper than her modest demeanour suggested. Clara's voice, tremulous, insisted she had been in her room during the murder, reading her novel. "I didn't go near the bridge," she said. But Novak's calm retort noted the mud on her shoes, observed by his officers. "Perhaps you took a walk, Miss Henshaw," he suggested. Clara's silence was telling, and Miss Marple, returning to her tea, pictured the governess's muddy hem from the bridge. A detail as damning as the footprints that had betrayed a whole little Haddington poacher years ago. Dr. Blackwell's interview followed, his bluster returning as he described his evening in the hotel library, studying maps of Prague's fortifications. "I was nowhere near the bridge," he declared, producing a crumpled library ticket as proof. Novak, unimpressed, asked about his knowledge of Victor's business, to which Blackwell replied with vague disdain. "Crane was a speculator, not a scholar. I had no dealings with him." Yet Miss Marple, overhearing this later from Beatrice, wondered at Blackwell's defensiveness, reminiscent of a little Haddington schoolmaster who had lied about his whereabouts during a theft. Beatrice herself faced Novak's scrutiny last, her composure fraying as she admitted knowing Victor through London society. "He was a disagreeable man," she said, her voice tight, "always prying into others' affairs." She confirmed she was with Miss Marple during the murder, a fact Novak accepted with a nod. As the group reconvened in the dining room, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the scrap of paper found in Victor's hand, its single word, debts, etched in her mind. She had seen such notes in Little Haddington, often tied to blackmail or betrayal, and she wondered who among her companions had the most to hide. A hotel maid, clearing plates, paused near Miss Marple, her eyes wide with gossip. "Pardon, madam," she whispered, "but I saw a figure in a cloak near the bridge last night, before the trouble. Couldn't see their face, mind." Miss Marple thanked her with a gentle smile, filing the detail away. A cloaked figure, she mused, was as vague as village rumours, yet often held a kernel of truth. She glanced at Clara, whose locket gleamed faintly as she adjusted her collar, and at Roger, whose forced laughter with Beatrice rang hollow. Blackwell, still scribbling, seemed oblivious, but his pen moved too quickly for mere notes. As the group dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting needles clicking softly. The dining room's opulence faded into the background as she sifted through the morning's revelations. Roger's debts, Clara's muddy shoes, Blackwell's alibi, Beatrice's fear, each was a piece of a puzzle, like the jumbled accounts of a Little Haddington fate that had ended in scandal. Victor's death, she sensed, was no impulsive act. The knife's precision and the note's message pointed to a calculated mind. She thought of the maid's cloaked figure, wondering if it was a stranger or one of their own, disguised by the bridge's shadows. Outside, the Vltava flowed silently, its surface reflecting the city's spires and secrets. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles in her hands, turned to the Charles Bridge, its statues standing as silent witnesses to the crime. In Little Haddington, she had once solved a theft by noticing a villager's mismatched boots. Here, in Prague, the clues were less tangible but no less telling. As she rose to join Beatrice for luncheon, she resolved to watch her companions closely, certain that the truth, like a poorly darned seam, would soon unravel under her gentle scrutiny. Chapter 4. The Locket's Secret. The Hotel Zlata's lounge, with its plush armchairs and a fire crackling in a marble hearth, offered a deceptive haven from the chill of Prague's autumn and the darker chill of murder. Miss Jane Marple sat near a bay window, her knitting a soft rhythm against the murmur of guests and the clink of teacups. The morning's interviews with Inspector Novak had left the group subdued, their faces etched with the strain of suspicion. Lady Beatrice Langley, her silver hair slightly dishevelled, sipped a sherry with forced calm, while Roger Langley paced near the bar, his artist's hands restless without a sketchbook. Clara Henshaw, curled in a corner chair, clutched her novel as if it were a shield, her locket catching the firelight. Dr. Ernest Blackwell, his journal now closed, adjusted his spectacles with a precision that belied his earlier unease. Miss Marple, her eyes as keen as ever, observed them all, her thoughts drifting to a Little Haddington seamstress, whose nervous tics had betrayed a hidden theft. Clara's solitude drew Miss Marple's attention. The governess, so quiet amidst the group's chatter, seemed to shrink into herself, her fingers tracing the locket's silver edge. Miss Marple, with the gentle persistence of one accustomed to village confidences, approached her, settling into an adjacent chair. "My dear," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "you seem quite fond of that locket. A family heirloom, perhaps?" Clara started, her pale cheeks flushing, but Miss Marple's kindly smile disarmed her. After a moment's hesitation, Clara opened the locket, revealing a faded photograph of a young man with her own sharp features. "My brother Thomas," she whispered. "He died 2 years ago. A gambler, ruined by debts. Victor Crane knew him. He had something to do with it, I'm sure." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was as alert as a hawk's. Clara's admission, like a villager's confession over tea, hinted at a motive deeper than mere dislike. "How dreadful for you," she murmured, recalling a little Haddington widow whose grief had masked a vengeful heart. "Did you ever speak to Mr. Crane about it?" Clara shook her head, her eyes darting to Roger, who was now arguing quietly with Beatrice. "No, but I wanted to. He was cruel. He profited from others' ruin." The words, though soft, carried a bitter edge, and Miss Marple filed them away, wondering if Clara's grief had turned to something darker on the Charles Bridge. The lounge door opened, admitting Inspector Novak, his hawk-like gaze sweeping the room. He carried a small evidence bag, its contents hidden, and beckoned Roger to join him in the private parlour. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, noted Roger's stiff nod and the way Beatrice's hand tightened on her glass. Novak's investigation, she sensed, was closing in, much like the time in Little Haddington when a constable's persistence had unravelled a poacher's alibi. She rose, ostensibly to fetch a fresh skein of wool from her room, but lingered near the parlour, her hearing sharpened by years of village eavesdropping. Novak's voice, calm but probing, carried through the door. "Mr. Langley, we've found evidence of forged paintings linked to Mr. Crane's business. He was blackmailing you, wasn't he?" Roger's reply was heated, though muffled. "I painted nothing illegal. Victor was a shark, yes, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple, returning to the lounge, considered the implications. Blackmail, she knew, was a poison that spread mistrust, much like the rumours that had once torn apart a Little Haddington choir. Roger's debts, now tied to forgery, made him a compelling suspect, yet his open desperation seemed too reckless for a calculated murder. Beatrice, catching Miss Marple's return, drew her aside. "Jane, I must tell you something," she said, her voice low, her pearl brooch glinting nervously. "Victor sent me a letter before we left London. He threatened to expose a family matter unless I paid him. I ignored it, but now—" She broke off, her eyes glistening. Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. The letter, like the scrap of paper in Victor's hand, suggested a pattern of extortion. "Did you keep it, my dear?" she asked gently. Beatrice nodded, producing a folded sheet from her handbag. The paper was thick, like the note found on the bridge, and the ink bore the same hurried scrawl. "Pay, or your secret will be known." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Blackmail, she thought, was a dangerous game, and Victor Crane had played it with deadly stakes. As Beatrice returned to her sherry, Miss Marple revisited the bridge in her mind, picturing the statue of St. Wenceslas and the mud-smeared cobblestones. On a whim, she slipped out of the hotel, her shawl wrapped tightly against the crisp air, and walked the short distance to the Charles Bridge. The morning crowd was sparse, and the statues loomed silently, their stone faces impassive. At the murder site, she knelt, her knees protesting, and examined a loose cobblestone she had noticed the previous evening. Beneath it, glinting in the sunlight, was a gold cufflink engraved with a delicate bee. She slipped it into her pocket, her thoughts turning to Beatrice and Blackwell. In Little Haddington, A misplaced button had once pointed to a thief. Here, the cufflink was a clue. But to whom? Back at the hotel, Inspector Novak emerged from the parlour, his expression unreadable. He approached Miss Marple, noting her return. "Miss Marple, you were on the bridge last night," he said, more statement than question. "Did you see anything unusual?" Chu smiled faintly, her demeanour as unassuming as a village spinster's. "Only the beauty of Prague, Inspector, though I did notice Mr. Crane seemed preoccupied." Novak nodded, his eyes lingering on her, as if sensing the sharpness beneath her mildness. He moved on to question Clara again, who repeated her claim of staying in her room, though her trembling hands suggested otherwise. As the group gathered for a tense luncheon, Miss Marple's thoughts wove together the morning's revelations: Clara's vengeful grief, Roger's blackmail, Beatrice's letter, and the cufflink's enigmatic bee. The maid's tale of a cloaked figure lingered, as did the mud on Clara's shoes. In Little Haddington, a gardener's muddy boots had once betrayed a midnight rendezvous. Here, the clues pointed to a deliberate act, cloaked in the bridge's shadows. Victor Crane, she mused, had preyed on the weaknesses of others, and one of them had struck back. As she nibbled her soup, her eyes rested on Clara, whose locket gleamed like a silent confession, and she resolved to unravel the truth with the patience of one who had solved many a village mystery. Chapter 5. A Tale of Two Letters. The autumn light in Prague had a peculiar clarity, casting the hotel's Latta's lounge in a glow that seemed to sharpen every detail, from the gleam of polished silver to the faint lines of strain on Lady Beatrice Langley's face. Miss Jane Marple sat by the same bay window as the previous day, her knitting needles moving with rhythmic precision, though her eyes were far from idle. The group, Beatrice, Roger Langley, Clara Henshaw, and Dr. Ernest Blackwell, sat scattered across the room, their silence heavier than the velvet drapes that framed the view of the Vltava. Victor Crane's murder on the Charles Bridge lingered like a shadow, and Inspector Novak's ongoing investigation had tightened the knot of suspicion around them all. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as a Little Haddington dressmaker's shears, sifted through the clues. Clara's locket, Roger's blackmail, Beatrice's letter, and the gold cufflink marked B. Each was a thread, but the pattern remained elusive. Beatrice, nursing a cup of tea, broke the silence with a forced brightness. "Jane, you must find Prague's history fascinating," she said, her voice a touch too loud. "All those old alchemists and kings." Miss Marple smiled, her response gentle but probing. "Indeed, my dear, though I find the present just as intriguing. People, you know, are not so different from those old tales, full of secrets and ambitions." Beatrice's smile faltered, and Miss Marple noted the way her friend's fingers twisted her pearl brooch, a gesture that recalled a Little Haddington widow who had clutched her rosary while hiding a stolen will. The lounge door swung open, admitting Inspector Novak, his lean frame moving with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to unravelling lies. He carried a folder, its contents hidden, and his gaze settled on Beatrice. "Lady Langley, a word, please," he said, gesturing to the private parlour. As Beatrice rose, her composure strained. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the letter Beatrice had shown her, its threatening words echoing the scrap found in Victor's hand. She decided to act, slipping the folded letter from her handbag and examining it again. The paper was identical to the bridge note, thick, cream-coloured, with a faint watermark of the Hotel Zlata's crest. The ink, too, matched, its slight smear suggesting haste or agitation. Miss Marple pieced together the torn scrap in her mind. Debts must be paid, or blood will spill. The similarity was no coincidence, she thought, recalling a little Haddington forger whose letters had betrayed him through their paper's grain. While Beatrice faced Novak's questions, Miss Marple approached Clara, who sat alone, her novel unopened. "My dear," she said, her tone as soothing as a village nurse's, "you seem troubled. Is there more about your brother you'd like to share?" Clara's eyes widened, but Miss Marple's kindly demeanour coaxed a response. "Thomas owed Victor money," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Victor hounded him, even after he died. He said I'd inherit the debt unless I helped him." Her fingers brushed her locket, and Miss Marple sensed a deeper wound, like the little Haddington girl who had sold family heirlooms to settle a debt. "Helped him how?" she pressed gently. Clara shook her head, tears welling. "I didn't. I couldn't. But I hated him for it." Roger, meanwhile, lingered near the bar, his charm replaced by a nervous energy. Miss Marple, observing him, recalled his heated exchange with Victor on the train, and Novak's mention of forged paintings. She approached, offering a mild comment about Prague's beauty, but her question was pointed. "Mr. Langley, your sketches must capture the city's charm. Did you finish any on the bridge?" Roger's smile was strained. "Lost my sketchbook that night," he muttered. "Must have dropped it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the absence of the sketchbook as a potential clue, much like a missing ledger had once exposed a little Haddington shopkeeper's fraud. Inspector Novak returned with Beatrice, whose face was pale but composed. He addressed the group, his voice measured. "We've uncovered evidence that Mr. Crane was involved with a Prague antiques dealer, possibly smuggling rare artifacts. Did any of you know of this?" Dr. Blackwell, who had been silent, cleared his throat. "I study history, not commerce," he said, his tone dismissive. "Crane's dealings were beneath my notice." Yet his fingers drummed on his journal, and Miss Marple wondered if his expertise in artifacts made him more than a bystander. Clara shook her head, and Roger shrugged, though his eyes avoided Novak's. Beatrice, however, hesitated, then spoke. "Victor mentioned a deal once, in London, something about Bohemian glass. I thought it harmless." Miss Marple's thoughts raced. Smuggling, like blackmail, was a motive for murder, and Victor's web of schemes seemed to entangle them all. She recalled a little Haddington smuggler who had hidden stolen goods in a church crypt, and her mind turned to the Charles Bridges statues. Could they hold more than history? She resolved to revisit the bridge, but first she approached Novak, offering the letter Beatrice had given her. "Inspector, this may be relevant," she said, her voice deferential. Novak examined it, his eyes narrowing as he compared it to the bridge note. "The same paper," he murmured. "Thank you, Miss Marple." She inclined her head, her modesty masking the satisfaction of a village sleuth who had outwitted a constable. That afternoon, Miss Marple strolled to the hotel's reception, where a young porter, Jan, polished brass with a distracted air. "Such a tragedy on the bridge," she remarked, her tone conversational. Jan glanced up, eager to gossip. "Yes, madam. I heard Mr. Crane argued with someone that night, near the hotel. A woman, maybe. Hard to see in the dark." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind adding this to the maid's tale of a cloaked figure. A woman, she thought, Clara with her muddy shoes, or Beatrice with her secret, or someone else entirely, like the little Haddington baker's wife who had slipped out at night to meet a lover. As evening fell, the group gathered for dinner, their conversation stilted. Clara avoided Roger's gaze, while Blackwell lectured on Prague's alchemical past, his voice louder than necessary. Beatrice, beside Miss Marple, whispered, "Jane, I'm frightened. What if Roger's next?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her thoughts on the cufflink, still hidden in her pocket. Its B could point to Beatrice or Blackwell, but the letter and note suggested a broader scheme. Victor, she mused, had played a dangerous game, and someone had ended it with a knife. As the Vltava's lights danced outside, she knew the truth lay close, waiting to be unpicked like a poorly knit stitch in a little Haddington shawl. Chapter 6. The Statue's Shadow. The dawn light draped Prague in a delicate veil, softening the sharp edges of its spires and bathing the Charles Bridge in a pale, ethereal glow. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, stepped lightly across the hotel's threshold, her modest figure blending with the early risers heading to market. The murder of Victor Crane had cast a pall over the hotel's larder, and the group, Lady Beatrice Langley, Roger Langley, Clara Henshaw, and Dr. Ernest Blackwell, remained under Inspector Novak's watchful eye. Miss Marple, however, felt the pull of the bridge, its silent statues beckoning like the old oaks of Little Haddington, which had once hidden a poacher's secret. The clues, Clara's locket, Roger's blackmail, Beatrice's letter, the gold cufflink, and the porter's tale of a woman's voice, were threads in a tapestry she was determined to unravel. Inspector Novak, informed of Miss Marple's intent to revisit the bridge, insisted on accompanying her, his curiosity piqued by the spinster's quiet acumen. They walked in companionable silence, the Vltava's waters murmuring below, its surface catching the first rays of sun. The bridge was nearly deserted, save for a lone artist sketching a statue and a vendor arranging trinkets. Miss Marple led Novak to the statue of St. Wenceslas, where Victor's body had been found, its stone base weathered but imposing. She knelt, her fingers brushing the loose cobblestone where she had discovered the cufflink marked B. "Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a village breeze, "might we examine this statue more closely? In Little Haddington, a hollow tree once hid a thief's spoils." Novak, his hawk-like gaze softening with respect, nodded. With a policeman's efficiency, he probed the statue's base, his fingers finding a subtle seam. A gentle push revealed a hollow compartment, barely large enough for a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside gleamed a collection of jewels, emeralds and sapphires, their facets catching the dawn light. Novak's eyes widened, but Miss Marple's remained serene, her mind racing. "Smuggling, as you suspected," she murmured, recalling the porter's hint of Victor's dealings with a Prague antiques dealer. The jewels, she thought, were the heart of Victor's schemes, much like the stolen silver that had once divided a little Haddington parish. Back at the hotel's larder, Novak secured the jewels in his evidence bag, his questions sharp as he gathered the group in the lounge. "These were hidden where Mr. Crane died," he announced, his voice cutting through the morning's hush. "Who among you knew of his smuggling?" Beatrice, her pearl brooch glinting, shook her head, though her eyes betrayed unease. Roger, his hands unsteady, muttered, "I knew he dealt in antiques, but jewels? No." Clara, her locket hidden beneath her collar, stared at the floor, her silence heavy. Dr. Blackwell, however, straightened, his scholarly air returning. "I study artifacts, Inspector, not contraband," he said, producing a library receipt dated the night of the murder. "I was researching Prague's history, as the librarian can confirm." Novak's assistant, dispatched to verify, returned with a nod. "The librarian saw Dr. Blackwell until late," he reported. Miss Marple, her knitting untouched, noted Blackwell's relief but wondered at its intensity, like a little Haddington grocer who had overplayed his innocence after a theft. Her thoughts turned to Clara, whose muddy shoes and confession about her brother's debt lingered in her mind. "Miss Henshaw," Novak said, his tone measured, "you admitted following Mr. Crane that night. Did you see him with these jewels?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I followed him to confront him about Thomas," she said, her voice breaking. "He laughed at me, said I'd never get justice, but I didn't kill him, I swear it." Miss Marple, her gaze soft but piercing, recalled Clara's trembling hands and the porter's mention of a woman's voice near the hotel. She approached the governess, her tone soothing. "My dear, you wanted justice for your brother. Did you see anyone else on the bridge?" Clara hesitated, then whispered, "A shadow, someone in a cloak near the statue. I thought it was Victor at first, but then—" she trailed off, fear clouding her eyes. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the clue into the pattern. The maid's cloaked figure, the porter's woman's voice, and now Clara's shadow. In Little Haddington, a cloaked figure had once been a vicar's wife, hiding an affair. Here, the truth was murkier. Novak turned to Roger, his questions relentless. "Mr. Langley, your debts to Crane involved forged paintings. Did they also involve these jewels?" Roger's face reddened. "I painted what he asked, nothing more. I never touched his cursed jewels." Miss Marple, observing his clenched fists, wondered if his anger masked guilt or fear. She drew Novak aside, her voice low. "Inspector, the cufflink I found, have you traced its owner?" Novak shook his head. "Not yet, but it's fine work, likely custom-made." Miss Marple's thoughts flickered to Beatrice, whose wealth could afford such trinkets, and Blackwell, whose scholarly facade might hide a greedier heart. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the lounge, her eyes on the Vltava's shimmering surface. The jewels confirmed Victor's smuggling, but the murder felt personal, rooted in betrayal, not profit. She recalled the note's warning, "Debts must be paid, or blood will spill." Its match to Beatrice's letter suggested a single hand, but whose? Clara's grief, Roger's desperation, Beatrice's secret, Blackwell's alibi. Each was a suspect, yet none fit perfectly. In Little Haddington, a baker's wife had once killed to protect her family's honour, her quiet demeanour hiding a fierce resolve. Miss Marple wondered if Clara, with her locket and muddy shoes, harboured a similar strength. That evening, as the group dined in strained silence, Miss Marple tested a theory. "Dr. Blackwell," she said, her tone conversational, "your knowledge of Prague's statues is remarkable. Did you ever study their hidden compartments?" Blackwell's fork paused, his eyes narrowing. "A scholar's interest, Miss Marple, nothing more." But his voice held a tremor, and Miss Marple filed it away, like the nervous laugh of a Little Haddington curate caught in a lie. Beatrice, sensing the tension, changed the subject, but her glance at Roger was anxious. Clara, silent, touched her locket, and Miss Marple knew the truth was close, waiting to be plucked like a loose thread in a village quilt. Chapter 7. The Unravelling. The Hotel Zlata's private parlour, with its heavy brocade curtains and polished mahogany table, felt stifling despite the autumn chill seeping through the windows. Miss Jane Marple sat near the fire, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her eyes as bright and watchful as those of a little Haddington sparrow. The group, Lady Beatrice Langley, Roger Langley, Clara Henshaw, and Dr. Ernest Blackwell, gathered at Inspector Novak's request, their faces a study in tension, each marked by the strain of Victor Crane's murder on the Charles Bridge. The clues Miss Marple had gathered, the locket, the blackmail letter, the gold cufflink, the hidden jewels, and the shadowy figure, wove a complex pattern, and she sensed the moment had come to unravel it, much as she had once unpicked a village scandal over a stolen chalice. Inspector Novak stood at the head of the table, his hawk-like gaze sweeping the room. "We have evidence," he began, his voice steady, "that Mr. Crane was a blackmailer and smuggler, killed for reasons tied to his schemes. I ask you all to be frank." His eyes lingered on Roger, whose debts and forged paintings had made him a prime suspect, but Miss Marple noted the young man's slumped shoulders, more defeated than guilty. Clara, her hands clasped tightly, avoided his gaze, her locket glinting faintly. Beatrice, her pearl brooch pinned with care, sat rigid, while Dr. Blackwell adjusted his spectacles, his scholarly calm a thin veneer. Miss Marple, her expression serene, spoke softly. "Inspector, might I share a thought? In my village, Little Haddington, the truth often hides in plain sight, like a mislaid key." Novak nodded, intrigued by the spinster's quiet authority. "Please, Miss Marple." She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and addressed the group, her voice gentle but firm. "Victor Crane was a man who profited from others' weaknesses, debts, secrets, even grief. His death was no accident, but a deliberate act, planned in the chaos of the bridge's evening crowd." She produced the gold cufflink, its bee catching the firelight. "This was found near the statue. I wondered if it belonged to Lady Langley or Dr. Blackwell, but there's another possibility." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her brooch. "Jane, you can't think." Miss Marple raised a hand, her smile reassuring. "My dear, let me finish." She turned to Beatrice, her tone kind but probing. "You showed me a letter from Victor, threatening to expose a family secret. You confronted him on the bridge, didn't you?" Beatrice's eyes widened, and she nodded, her voice trembling. "I did, Jane. He demanded money, said he'd ruin Roger's name. I told him I'd never pay, but I didn't kill him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling a little Haddington matron who had faced a similar threat. "I believe you," she said, her gaze shifting to Clara. "Miss Henshaw," she continued, "your brother's ruin gave you cause to hate Victor. You followed him that night, as you admitted, and your shoes were muddy, suggesting you were near the statue." Clara's face paled, her fingers clutching her locket. "I wanted to confront him," she whispered, "but I didn't." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her words were relentless. "You wrote the note found in his hand. Debts must be paid, or blood will spill. It matches Lady Langley's letter, written on hotel paper, in your hand. You meant to warn him, but when he laughed at your pain, you acted." Clara's sobs broke the silence, her composure crumbling. "He destroyed Thomas," she cried. "He took everything, our home, our name. That night, I followed him, begged him to return what he stole, a family ring hidden in those jewels. He mocked me, said I was nothing. I had the knife. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop." Her confession hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Novak stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Miss Henshaw, you must come with me." As his officer led Clara away, her locket fell open, revealing her brother's photograph, a silent testament to her motive. Miss Marple turned to the cufflink, addressing Beatrice. "You dropped this during your confrontation, didn't you? It was meant to mislead, but it helped me see the truth." Beatrice nodded, tears in her eyes. "I was afraid for Roger," she whispered. Roger, silent until now, reached for her hand, his earlier bravado gone. Dr. Blackwell, his alibi solid, cleared his throat. "A tragic business," he muttered. But Miss Marple noted his relief, like a little Haddington schoolmaster cleared of suspicion. The jewels, she explained to Novak, were Victor's smuggling venture, but the murder was personal. Clara's revenge, not greed. As the group dispersed, the parlour felt lighter, as if the truth had lifted a fog. Novak thanked Miss Marple, his respect evident. "You have a sharp mind, madam," he said. She smiled, her modesty intact. "Only an old woman's habit of noticing, Inspector." That evening, as she packed her suitcase, Miss Marple gazed at the Vltava, its waters reflecting Prague's golden lights. The city, like little Haddington, held its secrets, but human nature, its passions and frailties, was the same. She thought of Clara, driven by love and loss, and of a little Haddington girl who had once wept over a broken promise. With a sigh, she resumed her knitting, ready to return to her quiet village, where new puzzles, no doubt, awaited.